There was a pond in Lower Manhattan 60 feet deep, 48 acres of spring-fed fresh water, ringed by forested hills of American chestnut trees that grew 150 feet tall. The Lenape people camped along its southern shore. Dutch settlers arrived in the 1600s and called it Kalkhoek, Chalk Point, for the oyster shell middens heaped along its banks. The English renamed it the Collect Pond. For nearly 2 centuries, it was the primary source of drinking water for everyone living on the island. On winter Sundays, New Yorkers skated on it. On summer afternoons, they picnicked beside it. Robert Fulton tested an early steamboat model on its surface. In 1796, a visiting naturalist called it one of the most agreeable spots on Manhattan. Within 15 years, the pond would be gone. Within 25, the land above it would become the most dangerous neighborhood in the Western Hemisphere. And the reason was simple. The city poisoned its own water, buried it, built on top of it, and then acted surprised when everything sank. The trouble started the way it usually does, with good business. Tanneries set up along the pond's edge because they needed water to cure hides. Slaughterhouses followed because they needed somewhere to dump offal. Breweries came because brewing required enormous quantities of clean water, and at first, the Collect provided it. Isaac Coulthard built his brewery on the pond's southeast bank in 1792. Within a few years, the businesses that depended on the pond had ruined it. Animal carcasses rotted in the shallows. Chemical runoff from the tanneries turned the water dark. By the late 1790s, the Collect Pond was no longer a water source. It was a health hazard, a stagnant, reeking basin in the middle of a city that had tripled in population since the Revolution, growing from 33,000 souls to nearly 100,000, all of them desperate for room to build. The city had a choice. Pierre Charles L'Enfant, the same engineer who had laid out Washington, D.C., proposed cleaning the pond, restoring it, and turning it into the centerpiece of a public promenade. It would have cost money. The city chose the cheaper option. They decided to bury it. Starting around 1802, workers leveled a nearby hill called Bayard's Mount, at 110 feet, the tallest point in Lower Manhattan, and shoveled the dirt into the pond. They dug a 40-foot-wide canal to drain the remaining water west to the Hudson River. By 1811, the landfill was complete. 48 acres of fresh water, 60 feet deep, gone. In its place, flat, newly developable land in a city starving for real estate. Developers moved fast. Streets were paved. Middle-class row houses went up. The triangular open space at the center of the new development was christened Paradise Square. But here is the thing about burying a spring-fed pond. You can bury the pond. You cannot kill the spring. The underground water kept flowing. It had nowhere to go. Within a decade, the fill had begun to settle. The buried vegetation decomposed and released methane gas. The streets turned to mud. Not ordinary mud, but a reeking, sewage-laced mire that soaked through foundations and pooled in cellars. The houses shifted on their pilings. Walls cracked. Floors tilted. The stench was unbearable. And the middle-class families who had bought those row houses around Paradise Square did exactly what middle-class families do when the ground starts sinking beneath them. They left. What remained was cheap housing on unstable land, and not just cheap, but uniquely undesirable. Prospective tenants could smell the problem before they could see it. The methane leaking from the decomposing fill gave the air a sour, sulfurous edge. Puddles of standing water collected in every low spot, which was nearly everywhere, breeding mosquitoes in numbers that made summer evenings intolerable. Builders who put up new structures found their foundations cracking within a year. One tenement on Little Water Street, a footpath that had once skirted the edge of a place called Cow Bay, became known as Jacob's Ladder, because the front steps were so badly rotten and misaligned that climbing them felt like scaling a crooked scaffolding. Landlords who could not fill apartments at reasonable rents simply lowered the price until someone was desperate enough to take them. In early 19th century New York, there was no shortage of desperate people. The first to settle in numbers were free black Americans. New York's gradual emancipation law had been phasing out slavery for years, and on July 4, 1827, the last enslaved people in the state were officially freed. Many had nowhere to go and very little money. The sinking neighborhood south of Canal Street, where rents were low precisely because the buildings were falling apart, became the city's first significant free black settlement. Then came the Irish. A trickle in the 1820s became a wave in the 1830s, and a flood in the 1840s, when the Great Famine drove more than 1 million people out of Ireland and onto ships bound for New York. They arrived destitute, sick, often illiterate, and despised. No neighborhood in Manhattan wanted them. The only place that would take them was the only place no one else would live, the soggy, stinking blocks around Paradise Square, where the old collect pond still seeped up through the dirt and the buildings leaned like drunks. By the mid-1840s, the intersection of 5 streets, Orange, Cross, Anthony, Little Water, and Mulberry, had become the focal point of the neighborhood, and people had begun calling it by a new name, 5 Points. What happened next was something America had never seen before, and in many ways has never fully reckoned with since. Black and Irish families, both of them despised by mainstream Protestant New York, both of them desperately poor, were living side by side in the same tenements, sometimes in the same rooms. They shared hallways and outhouses and water pumps. They fought. They competed for the same miserable jobs on the docks and in the factories. They also married each other, danced together, worshiped in neighboring churches, and raised children who belonged to both communities. For all its horrors, 5 Points was the first large-scale instance of voluntary racial integration in American history. Nothing was forcing these communities to live together except poverty. And what poverty forced into existence, neither community entirely rejected. The physical center of the neighborhood was the building Isaac Coulthard had built as a brewery back in 1792, when the collect pond still glittered beside it, and the area was considered the outskirts of town. After the financial panic of 1837, when 363 American banks failed and thousands of businesses went under, the brewery closed. Beer production stopped. But the building remained, a 5-story hulk sitting on Cross Street just south of the intersection that was becoming 5 Points. Its new owners saw opportunity in the crisis. They carved the old brewing floors, with their high ceilings and deep, windowless interiors, into more than 100 tiny rooms and began renting them to anyone who could pay. Only the top 3 floors had windows. Some of the babies born in the lower rooms reportedly did not see daylight until they were toddlers. It became known simply as the Old Brewery. The 1850 census counted 221 residents in 35 apartments, averaging more than 6 people per unit. But contemporary accounts put the real number far higher. Some claimed 1,000 people lived inside. Along one wall, an alley led to a single large room where 75 men and women of assorted nationalities lived together. It was called the Den of Thieves. Along the opposite wall ran another corridor, darker and narrower. That one was called Murderer's Alley. According to the legend that grew up around the building, someone was killed inside the Old Brewery every night for 15 years. The number was almost certainly exaggerated. The fear it expressed was not. In 1852, a group of Methodist churchwomen called the Ladies of the Mission purchased the building and demolished it. In its place, they erected a new structure, the 5 Points Mission, dedicated to the improbable project of improving life in the neighborhood through education, employment, and conversion. The Old Brewery had stood for 60 years. It had been a functioning brewery for 45 of those years and a tenement for 15. And in those 15 years, it had become the single most infamous residential building in the history of New York City. By the 1850s, the 6th Ward, the municipal voting district that encompassed 5 Points, had a population density of more than 300 people per acre. With the possible exception of certain blocks in London's East End, it was the most densely packed neighborhood in the world. In the 6th Ward alone, there were over 1,600 tenements, 139 basement dwellings, and 116 grog shops. Cholera swept through in 1832 and again in 1849. Typhus was endemic. Yellow fever killed in waves. Infant mortality was staggering. The neighborhood generated 3/4 of New York City's typhus deaths by the 1870s. And it was onto this ground, this sinking, fetid, disease-ridden patch of buried pond, that the city decided to build its new jail. In 1833, New York's government approved plans for a combined courthouse and prison to replace the aging colonial-era bridewell. They chose a site on Center Street, directly on top of the old Collect Pond. The architect, John Haviland, designed the building in the Egyptian Revival style, inspired by an engraving of an ancient mausoleum in a popular travel book by John Lloyd Stevens. The structure was clad in dark Maine granite. It was 253 feet long, 200 feet wide, and it occupied an entire city block. To stabilize it on the waterlogged ground, workers drove enormous hemlock logs vertically into the earth as pilings. It did not work. The building began sinking almost as soon as it opened in 1838. Water seeped through the foundation. The cells were perpetually damp. Conditions inside were so foul that prisoners called it with grim irony, the Tombs, a name that stuck so thoroughly that every jail built on or near that site for the next 180 years would inherit it. Within the courtyard stood a gallows, connected to the main building by an elevated walkway the prisoners called the Bridge of Sighs. Over the decades, 50 people were hanged there. Charles Dickens visited in 1842 and called the cells indecent and disgusting dungeons that would bring disgrace upon the most despotic empire in the world. The prison, designed to look like an Egyptian tomb, built on top of a buried pond that would not stop seeping, housing the condemned of a neighborhood that should never have been built. There is an irony there that no one needed to explain to the people who lived it. Dickens, though, did not come to New York only to see the tombs. He came to see 5 Points. By 1842, he was the most famous writer in the English-speaking world. Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, the Old Curiosity Shop were all behind him. And he had made his reputation writing about the slums of London. He knew squalor. He had walked Seven Dials and St. Giles's, the worst neighborhoods that England could produce, and written about them with an eye both tender and precise. He arrived in New York on February 12th, was feted at a grand ball, dined at Delmonico's, met Washington Irving, and complained in a letter home that he was sick to death of the life I have been leading here, worn out in mind and body. He spent 3 weeks in the city, but he made time for 5 Points, escorted by 2 policemen who knew the streets well enough to keep a famous Englishman alive. He saw the narrow alleys diverging left and right and described them as reeking everywhere with dirt and filth. He noted the pigs wandering freely through the gutters, foraging in refuse. Self-reliant animals that, he suggested with characteristic wit, probably wondered why their masters walked on 2 legs instead of 4. He visited the tombs, and then his escort led him down a flight of stairs into a basement at 67 Orange Street, below a carpenter's shop, into a dance hall called Almack's. What Dickens found in that cellar was something that did not fit his narrative of misery, and to his great credit, he wrote about it honestly. A black fiddler and a tambourine player sat on a small raised platform. Couples danced on the wooden floor. And then a teenager stepped out, a young black man, and began to dance in a way Dickens had never seen. His feet struck the boards in rhythms that were neither Irish jig nor African shuffle, but something new, something that fused both traditions into a single percussive art form. Dickens was transfixed. He described the dancer as the wit of the assembly and the greatest dancer known. The dancer's real name was almost certainly William Henry Lane. The world knew him as Master Juba. He had grown up in Five Points, a free black man born in Providence, Rhode Island, around 1825. In the dance halls and saloons of the neighborhood, he had absorbed the Irish step dancing traditions of his neighbors and grafted them onto the West African rhythmic patterns of his own heritage. The result? Feet striking the floor in complex, syncopated patterns, the body loose and improvisational above the waist, was something that had never existed before. Dance historians now identify it as the earliest recognizable form of tap dance. It was born in a basement in the worst slum in America, invented by a teenager whom the world's most celebrated novelist happened to see on the right night. Master Juba's great rival was an Irish-American dancer named John Diamond, promoted by P.T. Barnum. Their challenge dances, staged at Almack's, the Bowery Theater, the Chatham Theater, drew enormous crowds in the mid-1840s. The New York Herald advertised them as great public contests. Here was a competition between Irish and black dancers in a neighborhood where Irish and black communities were simultaneously cooperating and clashing, producing something neither could have created alone. It is one of the more quietly extraordinary facts in American cultural history that tap dance was not invented in a theater or a studio. It was invented in a slum, on a floor above a buried pond, by people whom respectable New York would not have allowed through the front door. Dickens published his account of 5 Points in American Notes in late 1842, and the book accomplished something unexpected. Thousands of New Yorkers who had never dared visit the neighborhood were suddenly curious. Slumming, touring the district with a police escort, peering into tenements, visiting Almack's, became a fashionable pastime. The neighborhood's reputation, already dire, became international. And that reputation, once fixed, proved almost impossible to dislodge, even when the reality was more complicated than the legend. The gangs were real. The violence was real. But the gangs were not simply packs of criminals. They were organizations that grew from the intersection of poverty, ethnic solidarity, and local politics in ways that would shape the city for generations. The Dead Rabbits, an Irish gang that splintered from another 5 Points outfit called the Roach Guards after a dispute at a meeting — legend says someone flung a dead rabbit across the room — became one of the most feared organizations in the neighborhood. Their rivals were the Bowery Boys, a nativist gang of native-born Protestant Americans who saw the Irish flood as an invasion. The Bowery Boys were affiliated with the Know Nothing Party, which wanted to restrict immigration and bar Catholics from public office. Between these two groups, there had been more than 200 street battles in the 10 years before 1857. On the night of July 4th, 1857, Independence Day, the Dead Rabbits led a coalition of 5 Points gangs on a raid of the Bowery Boys' clubhouse. The New York Times reported that a crowd of young vagabonds from Cow Bay and the neighborhood proceeded to the Bowery and attacked. What began as a targeted assault escalated into a 2-day war that spread across lower Manhattan. Around 1,000 fighters were involved, armed with paving stones, clubs, brickbats, and whatever they could tear loose from the streets. The fighting surged back and forth between 5 Points and the Bowery, the Dead Rabbits driven back to Paradise Square, then rallying and pushing out again to Pearl Street, to Chatham Street, into the northern reaches of Park Row. The police, who were in the middle of their own jurisdictional crisis — just weeks earlier, the city's municipal and metropolitan forces had physically fought each other at City Hall in what historians call the police riot — were useless. In front of the old 6th Ward station house on Walker Street, the New York Times reported, the brawling gangs actually stopped fighting each other long enough to join forces and attack the police. 8 people were confirmed killed. Between 30 and 100 were injured. Looting and property destruction were widespread. Order was restored only when the New York State Militia marched in with fixed bayonets. What made the gangs so durable was not just desperation. It was that they served a political function. Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party machine that would dominate New York politics for much of the 19th century, recognized early on that the immigrant populations of 5 Points represented an enormous, controllable voting bloc. The system was elegant in its corruption. Ward bosses provided jobs, coal, food, and legal help to immigrant families. In return, those families voted as instructed. The gangs provided the muscle, intimidating rival voters, stuffing ballot boxes, marching repeat voters from polling station to polling station under assumed names. Isaiah Rinders, a Tammany operative and underworld figure who founded the Empire Club, ran the 6th Ward through the 1840s and 1850s with gangs as his enforcers. Fernando Wood, who served as mayor from 1855 to 1858, built his power base on 5 Points' Irish vote. The system turned gangsters into politicians with a directness that would have embarrassed a less brazen city. John Morrissey rose through the Irish gangs of 5 Points, earned a reputation as one of the most formidable bare-knuckle boxers in the country, ran gambling operations that netted him a small fortune, and eventually won election to the United States Congress. The path from 5 Points alleyway to the floor of the House of Representatives was neither long nor indirect. It ran straight through Tammany Hall. 6 years after the Dead Rabbits Riot, 5 Points was at the center of something far larger. In July 1863, the federal government began enforcing the Enrollment Act, the first military draft in American history, to fill the depleted ranks of the Union Army in the Civil War. The law allowed wealthy men to buy their way out of service for $300, roughly equivalent to 1,500 pounds of West India coffee, or the price of a small plot of land. For the Irish laborers of 5 Points, who earned $1 or $2 a day when they could find work at all, the provision was an obscenity. They were being ordered to fight and die in a war to free black workers who, they feared, would then come north and compete for the same miserable jobs on the docks and in the factories. Former Mayor Fernando Wood, now a congressman, had been stoking exactly this resentment for months, wielding the draft as a political weapon among his base of supporters, mainly Irish immigrants from the Bowery, the waterfront, and the 5 Points tenements. On July 13th, a Monday, mobs attacked the draft office on 3rd Avenue. Within hours, the violence had spread across Manhattan. For 4 breathlessly hot days, rioters burned buildings, attacked police, and, in the most horrifying dimension of the riots, targeted black New Yorkers with lethal fury. The Colored Orphan Asylum on 5th Avenue was burned to the ground. Black men were beaten and lynched in the streets. The 5 Points mission was ransacked. Black families from the neighborhood were driven from their homes, many fleeing to police stations or military installations for safety. Police Superintendent John Kennedy was nearly killed trying to disperse a mob at 5 Points itself. Federal troops returning from Gettysburg were eventually deployed to restore order. Estimates of the dead ranged from 120 to more than 2,000. The true number remains disputed. It was the deadliest episode of civil unrest in American history. The draft riots exposed in the most violent way imaginable the overlapping fault lines of class, race, and war that ran directly through the neighborhood built on top of the Collect Pond. 3 years before the riots, a different visitor had come to 5 Points. In late February 1860, a lanky Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln traveled to New York to deliver a speech at Cooper Union that would help propel him toward the presidency. The day after the speech, he visited the 5 Points House of Industry, a mission founded by a Methodist minister named Lewis Pease, who had concluded that converting impoverished Catholics was less useful than feeding them and teaching their children to read. Lincoln attended the Sunday school. According to accounts, the children sang for him, and he spoke to them briefly. 3 years later, the House of Industry wrote to Lincoln, now president in the middle of a civil war, to remind him of the visit. The letter survives in the Library of Congress. Whatever Lincoln saw at 5 Points stayed with him. The neighborhood where the poorest New Yorkers struggled to survive had briefly held the attention of the man who would soon redefine what the nation owed its most desperate citizens. By the late 1860s, the original 5 Points gangs, the Dead Rabbits, the Roach Guards, the Plug Uglies, the Shirt Tails, had largely been broken up by police crackdowns. What replaced them was, in some ways, worse. The Whyos, formed from the remnants of those older organizations, dominated the neighborhood from the 1860s through the 1890s. They were professional criminals in a way their predecessors had not been. One Whyo enforcer named Dandy Johnny Dolan carried a copper eye gouger and wore shoes fitted with axe blades in the soles. Another, a thug named Piker Ryan, was arrested in 1884 carrying a handwritten price list for services rendered. $2 for a punch in the face, $7 for a broken nose and jaw, $15 for biting off an ear, $19 for a broken arm or leg, $25 for a stabbing, $100 for, as Ryan's catalog phrased it, doing the big job. It was violence as a retail business, itemized and priced like goods in a general store. The Whyos' headquarters was a dive at 47 Baxter Street called Bottle Alley, a narrow passage between tenements that a photographer would soon make famous. That photographer was Jacob Riis, a Danish immigrant who had himself lived in poverty when he first arrived in New York. By the late 1880s, Riis was a police reporter working the 5 Points beat, and he had begun doing something no journalist had done before. Using the newly available technology of flash photography, he went into the back alleys, the basement saloons, the rear tenements, the flop houses, and he photographed what he found. His 1888 image of Bandit's Roost, a narrow lane off Mulberry Street, crowded with loitering figures, laundry strung overhead, a baby carriage visible in the shadows, remains one of the most reproduced photographs in American history. Riis published his work in 1890 as How the Other Half Lives, and the book hit the city like a bomb. For the first time, middle-class and wealthy New Yorkers could see in sharp photographic detail the conditions in which tens of thousands of their neighbors were living. Riis did not flinch. He photographed children sleeping in doorways on Mulberry Street, curled around heating grates in winter. He photographed men packed 12 to a room in 5-cent lodging houses on Bayard Street, lying in rows on plank shelves like cargo. He photographed the airless, lightless rear apartments where families of 6 shared 2 rooms with no running water, no ventilation, and no escape from the stench that seeped up from the cellars below. He photographed a cobbler working in a basement so cramped he could not stand upright. He showed the city its own face, and the face was gaunt. The Mulberry Bend, the crooked stretch of Mulberry Street that ran through the heart of 5 Points, so named because the street angled sharply to avoid the old footprint of the Collect Pond, he called the foul core of New York's slums. The book catalyzed a reform movement that had been building for decades. Riis had a powerful ally, Theodore Roosevelt, who, as police commissioner and then governor of New York, translated outrage into policy. The Tenement House Act of 1867 had attempted to regulate the worst abuses. A subsequent commission led in 1901 to the creation of the Tenement House Department, which imposed requirements for light, air, and sanitation that fundamentally changed how New York built housing for its poor. But the most dramatic act of reform was physical demolition. In 1895, the city condemned the Mulberry Bend, the maze of back alleys where the Whyos had held court, where Riis had taken his photographs, where generations of pickpockets and prostitutes and exhausted seamstresses and newborn babies had lived and died in rooms that never saw sunlight. The tenements were torn down. In 1897, the cleared land was dedicated as Mulberry Bend Park, designed by Calvert Vaux, the co-creator of Central Park. It was renamed Columbus Park in 1911. It stands there today, a few acres of open grass and basketball courts, bounded by the government buildings of the Civic Center on one side and the restaurants of Chinatown on the other. On summer evenings, elderly Chinese residents play cards under arc lights in the park. Almost none of them know that they are sitting on the site of the most notorious intersection in American history. But 5 Points was not finished producing monsters. By the 1890s, an Italian-American gangster born Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli, who reinvented himself as Paul Kelly, had gathered the remnants of the Dead Rabbits, the Whyos, and every other surviving 5 Points outfit into a single organization under his command. The 5 Points Gang, operating out of the New Brighton Dance Hall on Great Jones Street, eventually counted some 1,500 members. They ran prostitution, extortion, gambling, and robbery operations across Lower Manhattan. More importantly, they provided muscle for Tammany Hall, threatening voters, falsifying registration lists, stuffing ballot boxes in exchange for political protection. Paul Kelly's operation became a graduate school for organized crime. A young bouncer at a Coney Island dance hall named Alphonse Capone joined the 5 Points Gang as a teenager. He would later relocate to Chicago and, as Al Capone, build the most powerful criminal empire in the country. Charles Luciano, a Sicilian immigrant who would become known as Lucky Luciano and be credited with creating the modern American mafia, also passed through the 5 Points Gang in his early years. Johnny Torrio, who preceded Capone as boss of the Chicago outfit, was a 5 Points alumnus. Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, who would build the Las Vegas casino industry, had ties to the organization. The neighborhood that could not keep its buildings upright produced a criminal diaspora that reshaped the underworld of an entire nation. By the early 20th century, 5 Points as a distinct neighborhood was disappearing. The demolition of Mulberry Bend had been the first step. The construction of new courthouses and government buildings consumed block after block. The New York County Courthouse went up in 1926, devouring what had once been the northern edge of Paradise Square. The opening of the Manhattan Bridge approach in 1909 obliterated another swath of tenements. Italian immigrants who had replaced the Irish as the neighborhood's primary population in the 1880s and 1890s, bringing their own cuisine, their own saints' festivals, their own versions of organized mutual aid, were themselves being succeeded by Chinese immigrants pushing south from Mott Street. The 5 Points Gang dissipated around 1910, its members scattered into other organizations or into prison or into surprisingly legitimate careers. Paul Kelly himself eventually became a labor organizer, a transformation that would have astonished anyone who had seen him marshaling 1,500 thugs for Tammany Hall. The name 5 Points faded from common use. The streets were renamed one by one, as if the city were trying to scrub the stain from its own map. Orange became Baxter, Cross became Park, and then Moscow. Anthony became Worth. Little Water Street ceased to exist entirely. The 5-pointed intersection that had given the neighborhood its name was absorbed into a widened Worth Street. By mid-century, you could stand on the exact spot where the 5 streets had converged and see nothing but government buildings, parking lots, and the blank facades of courthouses. The neighborhood had been not just demolished, but erased. Its streets renamed, its landmarks razed, its story reduced to a vague association with the word slum. Then, in 1991, something remarkable happened. The federal government decided to build yet another courthouse near Foley Square, the open plaza that had replaced the northern section of 5 Points. Federal law required an archaeological survey before construction could begin. A team from John Milner Associates began digging. They expected to find the usual urban debris, broken brick, old pipes, the unremarkable infrastructure of a demolished neighborhood. They found 850,000 artifacts. From 22 abandoned privies and cisterns on 14 historic properties, the archaeologists pulled out the material record of a century of life in 5 Points. Clay pipes, hundreds of them, confirming that the ubiquitous images of Irish Americans with pipes clenched in their teeth were not exaggerations. Imported English ceramics, fine tea sets that the residents of this supposedly degraded slum had carefully maintained. medicine bottles of every description, children's toys, coins and buttons, animal bones that revealed a diet far more varied than the stereotype of desperate poverty would suggest. Beef and pork, yes, but also oysters, fish, and chicken. The artifacts painted a picture of people who were poor but not defeated, who set proper tables and drank tea from matching cups, and tried, amid genuinely dreadful conditions, to maintain the habits of civilized life. The sensational accounts of Dickens and the missionaries and the newspaper reporters, the stories of unrelieved depravity, of subhuman existence, had not been entirely wrong, but they had not been entirely right either. The archaeological record suggested something more complicated and more human. People doing their best in circumstances that made the best very difficult. Rebecca Yamin, the director of the Archaeological Project, and her team set up their laboratory in the basement of the World Trade Center to analyze the findings. 10 years later, the towers fell. Some of the artifacts were damaged. The researchers had to relocate. The objects from 5 Points had survived burial, excavation, and one of the defining catastrophes of the 21st century, a strange echo of the neighborhood's own long history of being buried, dug up, and built over again. Today, if you walk north from City Hall along Center Street, you will pass the Criminal Courts Building, a 1941 Art Deco tower that houses in its northern wing the latest incarnation of the tombs. Lawyers still call it that, so do cops. The nickname has outlived 4 successive jails, each built on or near the ground where the collect pond once spread. Turn east on Leonard Street, and you will find a small park, about an acre, with a shallow reflecting pool a few inches deep. This is Collect Pond Park, built in 2014 for $4.6 million. The pool is meant to evoke the old pond. Informational plaques along the walkway tell a compressed version of the story. Office workers eat lunch on the benches. Tourists pass through without stopping. Beneath the park, the spring still flows. It has flowed since the last ice age, since a block of glacial ice melted and left a depression in the sediment that filled with water from below. The city filled in the pond. The city built tenements and prisons and courthouses and parks on top of it. The city renamed the streets and demolished the buildings and erected new buildings and renamed the streets again. But the water does what water has always done. It finds the cracks. It seeps upward. Engineers working on the foundations of the nearby courthouses still have to account for it. The persistent, quiet pressure of an underground spring that was here before the Dutch, before the English, before the Irish and the Italians and the Chinese, before the Dead Rabbits and the Whyos and the 5 Points gang, before Al Capone and Master Juba and Charles Dickens and Abraham Lincoln, before the Old Brewery and the Tombs and Paradise Square. The pond is gone. The water remains. It is the oldest thing in Lower Manhattan, and it has not stopped moving.